Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade, where Vervunhive has just survived Heritor Asphodel's first storm upon the Hive city. And it survived it relatively intact. The curtain wall remained unbroken, and had only been successfully assaulted in a handful of locations, all of which had now been reclaimed by the Vervun Primary and their Imperial Guard allies. Furthermore, the only gate seriously compromised was the already broken gate at Veve. All in all, the defense had been handled quite brilliantly and effectively, although some weaknesses had certainly come to light, particularly the communications system. As a steady connection to Hive headquarters under the dual command of Marshal Edric Crow and General Hesketh Anko was spotty at best. Furthermore, the Vervun primary officers, although many of them had proven themselves to be courageous and efficient, also demonstrated a general lack of large-scale war experience, especially under such trying circumstances, and they were not meshing particularly well with the Imperial Guard, both due to the usual friction between natives and off-worlders, and also due to the fact that the Vervun Primary viewed this as their war first and foremost, and that the Imperial Guard were practically intruding upon their turf and trying to take command away from them. And, well, there was some truth in those allegations, fostering an unfortunate us versus them mentality, which was then further complicated by the command structure of the Hive itself, and the Vervunhive Primary Hive Commissariat, whose toes were being most thoroughly stepped on by the off-world commissars and their commanders. And to add yet another layer of complications on top of all of this, of course, there was the complicated political situation of the Hive itself to consider. Its High Master, Salvador Sondar's position was not firm, and there were many that were considering moving against him, but in a crisis like these, there were no real opportunities. Furthermore, the crisis itself also offered its own opportunities for potential advancement, both political and more immediately economic. And there were also those with other goals in mind, such as the people's hero, Commissar Cowell, who wanted off this rock and saw the war as an excellent opportunity to re-establish his bona fides with the new Imperial Crusade command. An ambition complicated quite severely by the presence, of course, of Ibram Gaunt, the very man who had Cowell exiled to Vervunhive in the first place. And then there's the friction between the Tarnith and the Blue Bloods, and so on and so on. Remember when I said that an Imperial High Commander needs to be a politician as much as a general? Well, I am revising that statement to say that they'd probably stand to gain from focusing about 75% of their attention on the politics. Still, blissfully unaware of all of this nonsense, the morale of the average Lasman was still quite high. They had resisted the first storm with fairly minimalistic damage. They'd taken casualties, of course, and the occasional wall gun here and there had been damaged or knocked out, and the wall had seen better days, but the defenses in their eyes were in no danger whatsoever from crumbling, and they had exacted a dire toll on the attackers, whose casualties must number in the hundreds of thousands at the very least, and probably millions. The one bright side was that this fanatical determination on the behalf of the attacker had blown away any hint of doubt as to the nature of the opposition, and so calls for further Imperial reinforcements had been put out. And already confirmation had been received that major Imperial reinforcements had been redirected to Verghast. All the defenders had to do was hold out and survive the second storm, which was even now beginning to brew out in the wasteland. Heritor Asphodel was not about to make the same mistake twice. He had expected the enemy defenders to be poorly organized and demoralized. A vast enough show of force should have been enough to send them scattering, and if that did not achieve the desired objective, then surely unloading thousands of troops directly onto the walls via the enormous motorized siege towers would put the enemy to flight. And were it not for the intervention of the Imperial Guard, this might very well have been the case. At the very least, one or two major penetration of the defences would have been achieved. And thereafter, the moment the Pharazoikans were on the walls and were assaulting the gatehouses from atop them, it would probably have been pretty much over for the defenders, as unfathomable amounts of reinforcements could have flooded into the city the moment a gatehouse was seized. Instead, his demonstrative escalation had been repulsed, and so the Heritor had to come up with a cleverer plan to inherit this particular imperial city. And come up with one he did. And it would include some of his favorite toys. And even as he was preparing, the Imperial defenders were doing the same, attempting to work out the kinks in their communication systems, and a few commanders even took measures somewhat in their own hands as well. One particularly interesting example of this came at Veve Gate. The command of the Vervun primary forces, as well as the Tarnith First and Only, and the North Call elements during the first storm had been far from perfect. And now the combined forces of the defenders had been placed under the command of Colonel Modil of the Vervunhive primary, an inexperienced field commander, placed in a position of authority over probably the single most obvious target along the entire wall of Vervunhive. If there was anywhere the defenders could be damn certain the enemy would strike, it was at Veve Gate. One can obviously understand why experienced field commanders, knowing for an absolute certainty that they were smack dab in the middle of the way of a major enemy offensive, might be quite nervous about the prospect of facing that enemy under an inexperienced commander. And so Colonel Korbeck of the Tarnith First and Only and Colonel Bulwar of the North Colony's Armoured and Infantry Regiments had agreed on a secret Vox message. Anvil. When and if either party sent this message over the Vox network, they would bypass the official lines of communications, and instead the Tarnith and the North Call elements would begin organizing and communicating with each other directly, without the Vervunhive primary forces. Again, one can see why they might do this, but it has some obvious dangers. And before a better solution could be generally implemented, the second storm began to strike. The first sign of it was a saturation bombardment, no longer at the shields, but the wall itself. Up until this point, the enemy had appeared content to simply hammer away at the shields, on the off chance that they might theoretically be able to overload them if they poured enough firepower into them. and the enemy certainly had no shortage of shells, so they might as well try. However, having failed to produce any results now, even after weeks of effective and consistent heavy bombardment, they now changed up tactics and began attacking the wall. Now, the wall itself, being made up of dozens of meters of reinforced permacrete, was not going to break or buckle to any substantial degree, virtually regardless of the period of time the enemy spent bombarding the wall. And furthermore, if the enemy's artillery guns were now close enough to be firing directly at the wall, instead of lobbing their shells up in the air to get extended range and falling down upon it, that also meant that the majority of the enemy's batteries were in range of the wall's defenses. A major risk, which was taken in order to pour fire onto the parapets and the gun ports of the wall in order to suppress the defenders and make it difficult for them to engage the approaching Ferozoican forces. Furthermore, the covering fire would make it far more difficult for the Vervunhive defenders to accurately observe the movements of the Heritor's armies. A valuable and deliberate addition, as this would not be a general demonstration and escalation like the first storm. Rather, this was intended as a far more directed surgical strike, with only a small number of objectives. The first being Sondar Gate, where the majority of the enemy's armor and super heavies attempted to batter down the very gate itself. This was in all due likelihood not a truly serious attempt, as the gates of Hive City are, not easy to breach, no matter the quantity of firepower you bring to bear, unless you could somehow bring a naval weapon down to the surface of a planet. You're not going to be getting through them anytime soon. However, the deployment of massed super heavies and the heavier armor available to the attackers indicated that their real intention here was not actually to cause a breakthrough, but rather to weather the enemy's fire as effectively as possible, thereby drawing Vervunhive reserves to Sondar Gate in the fear of a breakthrough that the enemy wasn't necessarily really planning on. The Heritor had next to endless reserves. The Vervunhivers did not, and so every gun, every man, every tank that could be redirected to Sondar Gate was one that wasn't going to be facing off against the two more important objectives. This exchange of fire would continue on for 2 more hours, until the diversionary attempt had drawn out as many Vervunhive forces as it could, and eventually began petering out thereafter. The second assault force headed towards Crow Gate. This one as well seemingly did not have the intent to overwhelm the defenders. Instead, it engaged the wall defenders in a running skirmish fight, where the Ferozoicans would assault the walls with their guns and then fall back into the broken hinterlands, then attack somewhere else and continuously do so. They were testing the defenses for weaknesses, seeing if any part of the wall had been abandoned, or if a section had been unmanned enough to send reinforcements to Sondar Gate, that a rapid escalation might have a hope of a quick victory. The Ferozoican hopes, however, were dashed, as whatever shortcomings Hive Command may have possessed did not extend to demobilizing their troops in sufficient numbers to allow the enemy any decisive local advantage. The occasional attempt was also made in the direction of the spoil heap, but were thwarted quite easily, and some far-ranging scouting forces were peeking at the edges of the citadel walls as well, towards the river Haas. But the river itself, deep and fast-flowing and overseen by massed wall guns, did not prove to be the weakness that the Ferozoicans may have hoped for. Largely, however, this second move was also a distraction, as the main effort was, as everyone had anticipated, focused towards Veve Gate. This saw the enemy's first deployment of their super heavy walkers, nicknamed Flat Crabs by the defenders. These enormous creatures, easily the size of a super heavy tank, were bristling with both close and long-range guns. But first and foremost, they were heavy assault platforms, with a frankly ludicrous amount of protection, and following behind them were massed batteries of assault guns and self-propelled artillery cannons. These all focused in on the wall guns surrounding Veve Gate, and at now, in essence, point-blank range in artillery terms, they no longer contented themselves merely with suppressing the defenders. They were bracketing and targeting one gun at a time, ensuring, through sheer quantity of firepower, that the permacrete cracked, broke, and shattered until the guns themselves were exposed and destroyed by overwhelming firepower. This required a remarkable degree of discipline and direct control from the Ferozoican forces, as they designated one weapon to be destroyed at a time, even as their own batteries were suffering heavy casualties. Unsurprisingly, self-propelled artillery cannons are not designed to be dueling with wall batteries as point-blank range, and their casualties must have been enormous. But as there were 10 attackers for every defending gun, the sheer, unyielding math of war saw the Ferozoicans triumphant. And the way leading up to Veve Gate, previously swept by earthshakers, autocannons, heavy bolters, and rocket batteries, was now clear for the enemy to approach, led by their flat crabs. Of course, the gate itself was still blocked by enormous quantities of rubble and, well, the carcass of a couple of siege spiders from earlier. The Imperial defenders and their engineers had done their best to mine it and make it as impassable as they could, but before the siege crabs there was, nothing much they could do. The guns blasted apart any obstacles that its enormous legs could not simply just crawl over, and so the siege crabs began to move into Veve Gate, where the crabs could do their real jobs. Enormously heavily armored from the front, the countless tank shells that the North Col armored regiments poured into them seemed to do very little, if anything at all. The first crab was only destroyed when a Vervunhive primary major, one Racine, ran towards one with a bag of explosives. The major was killed right before reaching his target by Ferozoican infantry flooding in after the tanks, but not having noticed what the major was carrying, the flat crab made the mistake of simply continuing on, crushing the major and a massive sack of high explosives underneath it. The skyrocketing fireball was of such ferocity it flipped the flat crab on its back, allowing the North Col armored regiments to destroy it, as its abdomen was predictably less armored than its frontage. A second crab would eventually be destroyed by simple massed cannon fire, pummeling its armor until simple structural stress caused them to break open and the vehicle to be destroyed. But by that time, the crabs had achieved their purpose. These enormous assault guns had engaged the North Col armor, keeping them busy and destroying dozens of them, allowing the Ferozoican infantry to begin flooding in around them and engaging the infantry defenders. It also allowed an opportunity for Pharozoican engineers to begin blasting away the rubble and the obstacles, leaving new routes open for tanks to begin rolling into the Hive city. Reinforcements were obviously and desperately needed, but with the various poking and prodding efforts made by the Pharozoicans, it was difficult to get authorization to move troops over to Vervunhive Gate. One of the first major columns to start moving were the Armenian armored regiments under the commander General Grismond, who mobilized his armored vehicles away from Sondar Gate as it became apparent that the enemy was not going to breach it, and attempted to rush towards Vervunhive Gate, but due to failing communications yet again, as everybody was screaming, everybody was panicking, and everybody was reporting attacks all along the wall, they were stuck in a gridlock. They were not given effective instructions as to how to reach their objective. They were simply told to continue making their way towards it, even though all of the routes they were designated to carry on through were completely gridlocked. Taking things into his own hands, General Grismond ordered his tanks off the main road arteries and into industrial districts nearby, ordering the tanks to lower dozer blades and simply start ramming through the structures in their way whenever they needed to. This caused quite a bit of havoc, of course, through an industrial district. And the tank column was stopped, not by the enemy, but by Vervun Primary Hive Commissariat troops, who of course were engaged in the unenviable task of attempting to control all of these thousands of Vervun Primary troops, all of the guardsmen, all of the logistical systems, and the continuing gridlocks. Their orders were simple: to move the armor along the designated routes. They themselves have no authority over actually designating those routes. They were following orders and attempting to get everybody moving as effectively as they knew how to do. And here was a mass of Imperial armor running through some of the Hive's most important industrial districts, causing God only knows how much damage. And in their eyes, ruining their homes and ruining their economic base, which they would need to rebuild the Hive, still assuming, of course, that they would be a Hive after the war. Meanwhile, equally understandably frustrated, General Grismond was looking down at these Hivers with no idea how to wage war, standing in his way, telling him that he couldn't move through an unoccupied industrial district and get to the actual fighting because they didn't have their paperwork in order. Things escalated very quickly indeed, with both sides yelling at one another. The Commissariat was staring down a column of tanks. Meanwhile, the Armenians could literally see the flashes from Vervunhive gates where their allies were being killed by enemy super heavy assault guns. Shouting turned to threats, threats turned to the Commissar placing his hand on his gun and unholstering it, causing General Grismond to strike him and disarm him, which the Commissariat troopers did not take very well at all, pulling their own weapons and essentially escalating the entire conflict to the point where either the two sides started shooting at one another or the Armenians surrendered. Colonel Grismond, understanding that this had gone way too far already, chose the latter. And to be clear here, the Vervun Primary Hive Commissariat is a commissariat force. They are subject to the authority of Imperial commissars, yes, but they are nevertheless commissars. And I don't know how to put this other than you do not hit a commissar regardless of what he does. And don't get me wrong, the Vervunhive Primary Commissariat are absolutely guilty of being obstructivist shitheads here, valuing paper far more than actual battlefield conditions. But this remains utterly and completely irrelevant. You do what the Commissar says, and you complain about it later. That is the only way this works, and that is the only way this was going to work here as well. As now, after having explored the alternative possibility of striking the Commissar, not only is the Armenian armor still not going anywhere, and not getting any closer to reinforcing their Imperial Guard comrades, in fact it's getting further away, as now the armor is stuck permanently and without a commander. Yes, this situation was not handled well by either party. And to add in an extra dash of confusion, at Veve Gate, Colonel Modiel's Vervun primary forces were struggling to resist the mass of Pharozoican troops who were flooding in through the broken gate and over the wrecked flat crabs. It became undoubtedly obvious that the Colonel was simply not up to organizing the complexities of a battlefront so intense and so entangled as this. He ordered his men to do things which they themselves already on the ground could see was impossible. Or at the very least, they deemed them to be impossible. And instead of accepting that on-the-ground assessment, Colonel Modiel would frequently engage in arguments with his troops, trying to get them to do what he wanted them to do. And to be fair here, the Vervunhive troopers were hardly any more experienced than their colonel, so a lot of this argumentation was doubtlessly in error on both parties. But a commanding officer, and certainly not a colonel, should never be arguing with his men. The very fact that he had to, or felt that he needed to try and convince them to do anything, was already a major command failing. And to obfuscate the situation yet further, of course, the Tarnith and the North Call elements had already agreed between themselves, as we mentioned earlier, that this colonel was a danger and not to be listened to. This made their formations even more difficult for the colonel to command, and made them near inherently resistant towards his orders. And then the code word Anvil was given. After that point, the Tarnith First and Only troopers and the North Colony armor and infantry regiments were no longer merely resistant of the colonel's orders, they had cut him out of their command net entirely, and would even start taking command over Vervunhive primary forces that they found milling about without adequate instructions. By virtually every definition in the book, this was a mutiny, with the Tarnith and the North Call having completely separated themselves from the normal and ordered system of command. And as they had shut off their own connections to the Vervunhive primary headquarters, they could not get any instructions, even if Colonel Modiel had any to give, nor could Colonel Modiel gain any good information from the Tarnith or the North Call. And surprise, surprise, rendering the colonel deaf and blind to the actions of 2/3 of his forces did not enhance his command capabilities. The front at Veve Gate was thus on the verge of collapse. The Pharozoicans were pouring in by the thousands. The reinforcements were stuck in the gridlock, with the most important element, the Armenian armor, of course, being permanently halted. The situation was only saved from the brink of complete catastrophe by the intervention of the people's hero, Commissar Pius Cowley, whom, the moment he'd heard the fighting begin, had turned around and headed out from the central command spire, grabbing any and all troops he could along the way. Vervunhive primary troopers, Imperial Guardsmen, it didn't matter, and with sheer force of personality, he reversed the traffic jams, turning troops, vehicles, and equipment around and back towards Veve Gate, where he arrived at the head of this mass of men man driven near solely by his own force of personality and righteous zeal. Throwing this pell-mell force in against the Pharozoikans, it provided enough of an impetus for the remainder of the defenders to rally around and begin routing the Pharozoikans back towards the gate, digging them out of the positions they had only barely started to form themselves to protect what they viewed as their most promising bridgehead. Say what you want about the Commissar, but on this day at least, he truly did earn the title People's Hero, as if he had been even an hour or two later, Vervunhive Gate may very well have fallen completely, and with no actual organized reinforcements on the way, it would have been up to the troops already there, already in a dangerously disorganized state, to somehow organize a counterattack to drive the Pharozoikans out of positions that they were even now beginning to dig themselves into. It would have been an extreme long-shot situation. But, due in large part, near exclusively in fact, to the People's Hero's intervention, the second storm was also weathered, and Vervunhive Gate was reclaimed. But one disaster narrowly averted was followed by another that Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt straight up walked into. Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt arrived at Vervunhive Gate along with additional reinforcements. These were troops that the Colonel Commissar had ordered to dismount from their transports and continue on towards Vervunhive Gate on foot. They arrived too late to take part in any of the fighting. However, the Colonel Commissar had been attempting to contact Colonel Modiel's communications bunker at the front line and had failed to do so. Both due to the, Hive-wide communications failure and the general overload of the Vox network, and in part due to Colonel Modiel's frustration with his forces not obeying his commands. He had ordered some of the communications equipment shut down, some of it for repair or scrutiny to see if it was even functional. The Colonel Commissar thus headed directly to the command post, where he found Colonel Modiel in not a very good state, and neither were his officers. It was pretty clear that things had not gone as they should have had here. And so, Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt ordered all of the personnel in the command bunker to surrender themselves into his authority. Furthermore, he would also seize all of the Vox communications equipment and look over the logs as well to see what he could untangle from this. Colonel Modiel objected quite vehemently, at which point the Colonel Commissar snapped. He was evidently in an incredibly foul mood, as described by the personnel within the communications bunker thereafter, and supposedly said something about too many, including Commissar Cowell, viewing him as soft. And shortly after stating this, he pulled out his service weapon and summarily executed Colonel Modiel. Now, I have oft argued that on occasion, the sledgehammer should win out over the scalpel. There are scenarios in which a demonstration of force and authority is a far more effective tool than any quantity of subtlety or cautious correction. But this was not it. The Colonel Commissar executed, outright, without a trial, a high-ranking Allied force, PDF equivalent officer, in his first combat engagement, with zero investigation for failing to maintain communications and provide orders during an engagement where a Hive-wide Vox failure was in effect, where parts of the Colonel's forces had actively and deliberately cut themselves off from his communications network and were acting independently of his command. and most damning of all, the testimony that he had said that some considered him too soft before he carried out the summary execution. This appeared, for all the world, as if an Imperial commissar had killed a PDF officer for no better reason than because he was having a bad day. This was, without question, an exceptional failure of judgment on behalf of Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt. And whilst he was within his right to do this, the obvious consequences of such an action were not long in waiting. As shortly thereafter, being summoned to Hive command, the Colonel Commissar elected to further compound his error, as he made an impassioned speech defending his actions to House Command by stating emphatically that the chain of command must be observed at all time, and any who breaks it must do so knowing they risk the highest penalty. To which Commissar Pius Cowell, of course, asked, "So, all who transgress must be punished?" To which Gaunt responded, "Of course." See, in the Colonel Commissar's mind, he was sure that Pius Cowell was simply desperate to get off-world, and a good word from Gaunt might just about do that, as it was his word that got him sent here in the first place. What the Colonel Commissar failed to consider was that he was no longer the War Master's favorite, and that thus the people's hero seeking his approval of all people would seem rather weird. Worse still, Ibram Gaunt had not kept up with communications traffic. You know, the crime he executed the Colonel for? Otherwise, he may have known that General Grismond had been arrested precisely for violating the chain of command, which the Colonel Commissar had just stated emphatically was absolute, and everyone who violated it must be punished. I'd like to say that Cowell somehow manipulated the Colonel Commissar here, but he really didn't. He really did not. And so, when Gaunt, of course, then demanded the release of General Grismond, he set an obvious double standard for House Command, that there was one rule for the Vervunhive primary forces, whom the Colonel Commissar clearly felt completely justified in executing out of hand with zero investigation, and the Imperial Guard forces, whom he now defended vehemently and demanded be released, also without investigation. If anything, if you really wanted to see what Commissar Pius Cowell could have done, imagine what would have happened if he'd snapped up the code word anvil, traded between the Tarnith and the North Col elements right before they cut communication to Colonel Modiel and began organizing with each other. The Commissar would have been well within his right to demand that Ibram Gaunt execute his own colonel, as well as the commander of the North Col forces, based on Colonel Commissar Ibram Gaunt's own goddamn testimony. Aye. To put it rather mildly, Ibram Gaunt had placed himself, make no mistake, in a very complicated position, where, again, to be fair, General Grismund and the Armenian armor were of pivotal importance to the war effort, and placing him on trial, with a potential execution hanging over his head for striking a VPHC officer, was mildly ridiculous, with the fate of the Hive hanging in the balance. But of course, the simple courtesy of giving him a trial was already far more than Gaunt had given to the Vervunhive primary, and so he had no position to argue from. He had no legal standpoint other than to pull rank, which is exactly what he did, arguing again correctly that the ranking Imperial Commissar, that being Ibram Gaunt, had the ability to block any efforts on behalf of local law enforcement to prosecute a Imperial Guard officer, even if the charges laid out against aforementioned officer were exactly the charges that Gaunt had just confirmed. This, needless to say, did not help relationship with Hive Command much, as they now reasonably felt like second-class citizens in defense of their own Hive. So yeah, things could be going better, but hey, they'd survived the second assault, hadn't they? Surely there'd now be a nice little pause before anything worse happened, right? Right. Even as the Imperial headquarters staff were busy attempting to tear each other's throat out, largely thanks to the Colonel Commissar, every single loudspeaker in the city and every single loudspeaker outside the city as well in the Pharazoican lines began blaring out the same name at maximum volume: Heritor Asphodel. Heritor Asphodel. Again and again and again, as the Chaos Forces launched a mass jamming attack on all frequencies. Well, I say jamming, as that was certainly the effect they achieved, but it was also largely a moral attack and a declaration that the Heritor himself had reached the front line. And the third storm was going to be by far the worst of all. And obviously, you're gonna have to wait until next week for that one. Until then, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.